Class we talked about the concept of environmental science, ecosystem, the various components and classification. In this session we will be discussing about food chain, food web, pyramids and biomagnification. Now these are some of the very general topics, but what we would be emphasizing in this class would be the exceptions to these and some major differences among these. So we'll start with understanding few basic terms. First is producer. So producer is one that produces food. So the best example I can say are green plants. In presence of sunlight, by the process of photosynthesis, they produce food. The next is consumer. Consumers are those who consume food. Now consumers can be of various kinds. Those who consume directly from the producer are known as the primary consumers, or I can say first degree consumers. Now example of this would be grasshopper. Then there can be secondary consumers. Secondary consumers are those who consume the primary consumers or who feed on the primary consumers. For example, frog. Now secondary consumers can be carnivorous or omnivorous. Primary consumers are mainly herbivores. Secondary consumers can be either carnivorous that feed on animals and omnivorous that can feed both on plants and animals. Then there can be tertiary consumers, for example a snake. And finally there would be decomposers or scavengers who would feed on the dead material, and these are mainly fungi or bacteria found in soil that decompose the dead matter. So as you can see, what is formed here is a kind of chain, and this is what is known as food chain. So in an ecosystem you have certain relationship or certain interaction between one species and the other, and that is important to maintain the balance of the ecosystem, and this is what is known as the food chain. The next is food web. So food web stands for interaction among various food chains. So I have frog. That frog would be consuming another insects. This snake would be consuming not only frog but other animals, small animals. Okay, and these would be further consuming grasshoppers and so on. So there is a kind of mixed interrelationship between various organisms and their feeding patterns. And finally you have the trophic level, which stands for the hierarchy that explains their position in the ecosystem. So it talks about their position in the ecosystem. And once we understand the trophic level, we can understand the concept of pyramids. So let's move one by one. The first is the food chain. So as I said, in presence of sun, you have green plants and green organisms that usually produce food, and those are known as producers. The next is the herbivores, which consume the producers. After herbivores you have the first level of carnivores, the second degree of carnivores and the third degree of carnivores, and finally human beings, which can be considered as omnivores, which consumes both plants as well as animals. So this is what is a basic food chain. Now as I explained, food web is an interaction of various animals being consumed by various other animals, and this is important to maintain a balance in the ecosystem. For example, let's take the previous case that we discussed. So we have plants, grasshoppers, frog and a snake. What would happen if there were no snakes? If there were no snakes, the population of frog would bounce up, and if there would be so many frogs, what would happen? The population of grasshopper would decline. So there would be a kind of imbalance in the ecosystem. So it's very important to have a balanced ecosystem, and for a balanced ecosystem there are food chains and food webs that exist in the ecosystem. So these are the various trophic levels that we explained. So you have primary producers who by the process of photosynthesis produce their own food. Then the primary consumers, which are primarily herbivores which depend on plants for their food. The next are carnivores or omnivores, which are secondary consumers. And finally you have the top carnivores or the tertiary consumers which feed on the secondary consumers. And finally you have within the soil, you have the various fungi and the bacteria that act as decomposers or scavengers. So once we understand this trophic level, we can understand this in the shape of a pyramid. So while understanding this, we talk about pyramids. Now pyramids can be of three types. First is pyramid of number, pyramid of biomass, and pyramid of energy. Now while understanding this, we must be very familiar with the laws of thermodynamics. So while understanding pyramid of energy, we will talk about the second law of thermodynamics. For now, the first law of thermodynamics states energy can neither be created nor be destroyed, it can just be transformed from one form to another. As you can see here, you have energy that is being transformed from one form to another, and it is applicable to all the pyramids that we talk about. Now when we start with each of the individual pyramids, most of the cases when you will be studying ecological pyramids, you will come across just an upright version of the pyramids. But it's very important to note there are certain major important exceptions to these ecological pyramids. To demonstrate that, a best would have been a kind of building blocks that children used to play. So right now, in place of that, we are using three different sizes of mobile phones to explain the various types of ecological pyramids. Now, the first is the ecological pyramid of number. So when I say an upright pyramid, it means producers are maximum in number, and as I go towards the top of the ecological pyramid, the number decreases. The best example I can say is here. So you have huge number of plants, few number of grasshoppers, and further few number of frogs that feed on the grasshoppers. So this is a kind of upright pyramid that we can understand. Now let's talk about an inverted pyramid. So on human being, you have numerous lice that comes out. So any animal and the parasites on it would be an example of inverted pyramid. So what is happening here is human being is, I am talking about one human being, but on that one human being there are numerous lice. So when we talk about ecological pyramids of number, we focus on the individual number. So as I said, in case of upright, plants would be lot, grasshoppers would be less, further frogs would be less, and snakes would be very few. But in case of inverted pyramid of number, you have few human beings and numerous lice on the human beings. Then there can be staggered pyramids. So you have one pyramid. So we would be discussing these two kinds of staggered pyramids. Okay. Now let's first talk about this. So you have few plants, numerous aphids on it, and few ladybirds which feed on those aphids. So this would be a kind of staggered pyramid like this. The next we would be talking about another exception, which is a staggered pyramid with smaller center portion and huge or bigger sized portion on the top. So I can say this would be my configuration. So you have few plants, further few caterpillars which are feeding on these plants, but numerous parasitic wasps which are feeding on these caterpillars. So this would be a kind of another staggered pyramid of number that we would be trying to understand. Now Let's move on to the next, that is pyramid of biomass. When I talk about pyramid of biomass, we try to understand the mass of an individual multiplied by the number of an individual. So mass multiplied by number of individuals would give you the biomass. Now one of the major disadvantages of ecological pyramid of biomass is in order to take the dry biomass, you need to kill the organisms. So that's one of the major disadvantages, because you cannot calculate it very exactly or precisely, I could say. So upright is the most common form. So in any ecosystem you would have the biomass of plants to be maximum. Further, animals feeding on plants would be less, and further animals feeding on those primary consumers would be further less in biomass. Biomass is usually measured in grams per meter square, and in case of terrestrial ecosystem we talk about when we talk about grams per meter square, we talk about either the volume, and that would be gram per meter cube in this case. So these are the two cases that we try to understand. Now when we talk about inverted biomass pyramid, the best example would be an oceanic ecosystem. So under an ocean ecosystem, I can say you have phytoplanktons and zooplanktons. Phytoplanktons have a lesser biomass of say 4, and I can say zooplanktons would have much higher biomass as compared to phytoplanktons, that could be around 20 to 25. So this would be a case of inverted exception to the pyramid of biomass, which is inverted. And finally we move on to pyramid of energy. Now pyramid of energy, from each trophic level, moving on from one trophic level to next trophic level, only 10% of the energy is transferred to the further trophic level or further hierarchical position. When I say 10% of the energy is transferred, that means 90% of the energy that was there is lost. Now how can we apply second law of thermodynamics to energy pyramid? When I say energy pyramid, under second law of thermodynamics, we say whenever energy is changed from one form to another, the proportion of usable energy is lost. And this is very clear from this energy pyramid. So you have highest energy with the producers. So if I talk, it was 100. Okay. The next level it would be 10. The next level it would be 1. And further level it would be 0.1. Now there are sometimes numericals that are asked based on the energy pyramid. So while solving the energy pyramid, the unit is joules for energy, and if the question says the energy of the producers is 200 kilojoules, what would be the energy at the secondary consumer level? So if I say at the producers it is 200 joules, at the primary consumers it would be 20 joules, and at the secondary consumers it would be 2 joules, because only 10% of the energy is further transferred, and this is what is known as the Lindman's 10% law. Propounded after his name. So specifically for pyramid of energy, it's always upright. You cannot say pyramid of energy has kind of any exceptions to it. So pyramid of energy is always upright. So we talked about the three pyramids, pyramid of number, mass and energy. In the next slide you can see here is another exception that we have taken to explain the pyramid of number. So you have an oak tree which is few, a numerous caterpillar population. So numerous caterpillar population, few birds and other very few hawks on it. So this is a kind of staggered example or exception to the pyramid of number. Now coming on to the concept of productivity, when we talk about the energy pyramids, we must understand the concept of productivity. So productivity can be expressed in two forms. It is GPP and NPP. GPP is the gross primary productivity and NPP is the net primary productivity. So first let's talk about the gross and the net. So gross is the total amount and net includes the final amount after the depreciation. So for example, if I have a huge bulk of say spinach that I have brought to my home, so I have the stems and the leaves of the spinach, but while cooking I would use only the leaves. So this portion is reduced. So when I talk about the whole bunch of spinach, it would be gross, and when I talk about only the leaves that I have taken to prepare the meal, it would be net. So gross could be depicted as, or I could say net could be depicted as, net primary productivity could be depicted as gross primary productivity minus the energy used by the autotrophs. So whatever energy in case of ecosystem is being used by autotrophs is deducted from the gross primary productivity to obtain net primary productivity. Now net primary productivity varies from region to region. Usually estuarine areas, moist forest areas have very high net primary productivity of say around 2000 as compared to desert region which is around 70 and further polar regions which is around 3. So as we move towards extremes, the net primary productivity decreases because you can say when balancing this equation, you have higher loss during this process. So we talked about the concept of productivity. Now a very important concept is the concept of biomagnification. Now there are numerous students which get confused with the three concepts, that is concept of biomagnification, bioaccumulation and bioconcentration. Now let's try to understand all these three concepts independently. We'll first talk about the most important concept, that is biomagnification, and it is also known as bioamplification. So amplify or magnify means to zoom something. So I have something, and if you are trying to see a bigger version under a microscope, it would be zoomed, and that is what is biomagnification. So biomagnification clearly states that if there is any content of pesticides that is introduced at the level of producers, as it goes up the trophic level, its concentration ought to increase. So the concentration of that pesticides in plants would be very less, but those plants when consumed by certain animals would show higher concentration, and finally if human beings is consuming those animals, they will show further higher concentration, and this is what is known as biomagnification. A classic example of this was when DDT was banned. The story behind this was very simple. DDT was a major pesticide that was used in the farm areas, not only in India but globally. So what happened in US was there was a ban on DDT. The reason being there was thinning of the shells of pelican. Now pelican is a popular bird of that region. What happened was the eggshells got thinner and thinner. As a result, there was a sudden decline in the population of pelican. When the research was done to understand the reason, it came out to be the biomagnification or amplification at each trophic level. So that DDT that was introduced into the soil went into the plants, further into the small insects, and finally into the body of pelicans. And when it went into the body of pelicans, the amount of the pesticide increased at a much higher rate, and that led to thinning of the shells and finally decline in the population of pelican birds. So this is one of the major well-renowned examples I could say for biomagnification. The next is bioaccumulation. Bioaccumulation means concentration of certain chemicals into the body or into any organism. So here it's talking just about accumulation. It's not saying that it increases with each trophic level. It's the very basic difference. So it's important to understand bioaccumulation is talking about individual entity. So when I say it's plants, it's talking about just plants or producers or just the primary or secondary consumers, and it's independently talking about the amount of pesticides or chemicals that is present in that body. Now finally is bioconcentration. Bioconcentration is classically used in aquatic ecosystem. So when we say under an aquatic ecosystem, the amount of chemical in the body of an aquatic organism is much higher as compared to its surrounding. The reason being that organism is absorbing the toxic substances at a much higher pace as compared to the catabolic processes. So there are two processes, one is catabolism and anabolism. Anabolism is the building process that tries to join up, and catabolism is the destructive process that breaks out. So when I say the catabolic activities, it's a kind of excretory process. So the absorption of toxins in the body of an aquatic organism is much higher and at a much higher pace as compared to the catabolic activities of that organism. As a result, there are higher chemical concentrations in aquatic organisms as compared to their surroundings, and this is what is known as bioconcentration. So the differences between these three terms, bioconcentration, bioaccumulation, biomagnification or bioamplification, is very, very important. So with this we cover the basics of food chain, food web, the food pyramids, the exceptions to food pyramid, and finally the basic differences between these three terms. We would be covering the various kinds of nutrient cycles, the sedimentary and the atmospheric cycles in the further classes. You can subscribe to our channel for any further updates. Have a good day ahead.